Ake Collins never thought his phone would ring at 3 a.m. with a job offer that would change his life forever. But there he was, sitting on the edge of his bed in his tiny apartment, listening to a woman's voice tell him about work that paid more in 6 months than he'd made in the last 2 years. "We need someone with your background," the voice said. "Someone who knows how to keep quiet and follow orders." Jake rubbed his eyes and looked around his messy apartment. Bills were piled up on his kitchen table. His landlord had already called twice about late rent. After leaving his security job with the military, regular work had been hard to find. Most companies wanted someone younger, someone without the kind of experience that came with too many sleepless nights in dangerous places. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Guard duty. 6 months. Remote location. Everything you need will be provided." The pay she mentioned made Jake sit up straight. It was enough to clear all his debts and maybe even start over somewhere new. Something in her tone made him nervous. Jobs that paid that much usually came with problems. "I'll need to think about it," he said. "You have until tomorrow morning. Someone will be in touch." The line went dead and Jake stared at his phone. He knew he didn't really have a choice. Savings were gone and his credit cards were maxed out. This mysterious job was probably his only way out of the hole he dug himself into. The next morning, a black car pulled up outside his building. The driver didn't say much, just handed Jake an envelope with travel documents and told him to pack light. 3 hours later, Jake was on a small plane heading west, still not knowing exactly what he'd gotten himself into. The flight took them over endless desert. When they finally landed, Jake found himself at what looked like an old research station in the middle of nowhere. The buildings were low and white, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. It reminded him of military bases he'd worked at before, but something felt different here. More secretive, more serious. Dr. Lisa Chen met him at the entrance. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and the kind of serious expression that meant business. She led him through several security checkpoints, each one more thorough than the last. "What exactly am I guarding?" Jake asked as they walked down a long hallway lined with doors that had no windows. "Someone very important, Doctor," Chen replied. "Someone who needs constant protection." They stopped at a door marked only with the number 7. Dr. Chen pulled out a key card and looked at Jake seriously. "What you're about to see cannot leave this facility. You've signed agreements that make that very clear. Do you understand?" Jake nodded. He'd signed plenty of papers that morning, most of them talking about secrecy and severe consequences for breaking it. Dr. Chen opened the door. The room looked like a comfortable apartment. There was a bed, a small kitchen, bookshelves, and a couch facing a large window that looked out onto the desert. But sitting on that couch was someone who definitely wasn't human. She was about the same height as an average woman, but her skin had a soft, pale glow like moonlight. Her hair was white as snow and seemed to move slightly even though there was no breeze. But it was her eyes that made Jake's breath catch. They were large and dark, like looking into deep water at night. And when she looked at him, he felt like she could see right through him. "This is subject X7, Dr. Chen said in a clinical tone. "We recovered her from a crash site 3 years ago. She's been cooperative, but we need someone to ensure she stays secure." Jake stared at the being on the couch. She was looking back at him with what seemed like curiosity, tilting her head slightly like she was trying to figure him out. There was something almost human about the gesture, but everything else about her was clearly from somewhere else. "She's an alien," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to Dr. Chen. "We prefer to call her a recovered subject," Dr. Chen replied. "Your job is simple. Make sure she doesn't leave this room without authorization. Protect her from any potential threats. Report any unusual behavior to me immediately." "Does she? ... Does she talk?" "She understands English, but she rarely speaks. She seems to prefer observation to conversation." Jake looked at the being again, and he got the strange feeling that she understood every word they were saying. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. Dr. Chen showed him the rest of the facility. There were observation rooms where scientists could watch the alien through one-way glass. There were laboratories full of equipment Jake didn't recognize. There were sleeping quarters for the staff and a cafeteria that served meals at specific times. Your shifts are 12 hours on, 12 hours off, Dr. Chen explained. Night shift starts at 8 p.m. Day shift takes over at 8 a.m. You'll have access to books, movies, whatever you need to stay alert during the quiet hours. What about her? What does she do all day? She reads. She watches the desert through her window. Sometimes she draws, though we haven't figured out what the images mean yet. She's remarkably peaceful for someone in her situation. That night, Jake started his first shift. The facility was much quieter after dark, with only a skeleton crew of scientists and security guards on duty. Jake sat in a chair outside the alien's room, watching monitors that showed different angles of her quarters. She was sitting by her window, looking out at the stars. The desert sky was clearer than anything Jake had ever seen, with millions of stars visible in the darkness. She sat there for hours, perfectly still, like she was searching for something among all those distant lights. Around midnight, Jake decided to check on her in person. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside. She turned to look at him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Just checking to make sure you're okay," Jake said. He's feeling a little foolish for talking to someone who might not even understand him. She nodded slightly, then turned back to the window. Jake was about to leave when she did something unexpected. She pointed to the stars, then looked at him with an expression that seemed to ask a question. "You miss home?" Jake asked softly. This time her nod was definite. And in that moment, Jake realized that whatever she was, wherever she came from, she was someone who had been taken from her home and was being kept here against her will. The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. He looked at her more closely. Her clothes were simple and clean, but they looked like they'd been provided by the facility. Her hair was longer than most women wore it, and she had a small scar on her left hand that looked old. These weren't the details of a dangerous prisoner. They were the details of someone who had been living in this room for 3 years, watching the desert and missing her home. "I'll let you get back to your stargazing," Jake said, backing toward the door. "If you need anything, just, wave at the camera or something." She looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in her expression. Then she turned back to the window, and Jake left her alone with the stars. As he settled back into his chair, Jake found himself thinking about the being in that room. Dr. Chen had called her a subject, but everything about her seemed more like a person than a thing to be studied. And if she was a person, then what they were doing here wasn't research, it was imprisonment. The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He'd taken this job because he needed the money, but he was starting to wonder what price he'd really agreed to pay. Looking at the monitors showing her silhouette against the starlit window, Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that this assignment was going to be much more complicated than anyone had told him. He spent the rest of that first night shift watching her and trying not to think about what it would be like to be so far from home with no hope of ever seeing it again. But the thoughts kept coming anyway, and by morning, Jake knew that everything about this job was going to be different than he'd expected. The alien wasn't just his assignment. She was someone who needed more than just guarding. She needed someone who could see her as more than just a recovered subject. And despite all his training and experience, Jake was starting to realize that he might be that someone. 3 weeks had passed since Jake started his assignment at the facility, and he thought he had everything figured out. The alien woman kept to herself during the day, reading books that Dr. Chen provided or sitting by her window watching the endless desert. At night, she would stare at the stars for hours, sometimes moving her finger in the air like she was tracing patterns only she could see. Jake had fallen into a routine too. He would arrive for his night shift, check the monitors, walk through the facility once every hour, and spend the rest of his time reading or watching old movies on his tablet. It was quiet work, almost boring, which made him think this job might not be as complicated as he'd first worried. That all changed on a Tuesday night in his 4th week. Jake was sitting in his usual chair outside her room, scrolling through news on his phone, when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a voice, soft and musical, coming from inside the room, but that was impossible. The alien woman never spoke. Dr. Chen had made that very clear during his training. He looked at the monitors, and there she was, sitting on her couch, lips moving as if she was talking to someone. But she was alone in the room. Jake grabbed his keys and quietly opened the door, expecting to find that she was maybe talking to herself or practicing words she'd heard. Instead, she was looking right at the door when it opened, as if she'd been waiting for him. "Hello, Jake," she said in that same musical voice he'd heard through the door. Jake nearly dropped his keys. Not only was she speaking, but she knew his name. He'd never told her his name. None of the scientists had mentioned it in front of her, at least not that he could remember. You can talk," he said, feeling stupid for stating the obvious. "I have always been able to talk," she replied, tilting her head in that curious way he'd gotten used to. "I simply chose not to. But you look sad tonight, and sadness should not be carried alone." Jake looked around the room nervously. There were cameras everywhere, and Dr. Chen had made it clear that any unusual behavior should be reported immediately. But something about the way the alien woman was looking at him made him step inside and close the door behind him. "I'm not sad," he said, though, even as the words came out, he knew they weren't true. "You think about someone," she said gently. "Someone who used to make you happy but now makes you hurt. Can see it in your eyes." Jake stared at her. Could she possibly know about Kelly? His ex-fiancée had left him 6 months ago, saying she couldn't handle the stress of his job and the way he shut down emotionally after his last deployment. It was part of why he'd ended up in such a desperate financial situation. Part of why he'd taken this job in the first place. "Can see that?" he asked. "Pain recognizes pain," she said simply. "I have been alone in this room for 3 years, watching the stars and remembering a home I may never see again. You have been alone much longer, I think, even when you were surrounded by people." There was something about her voice that made Jake want to sit down. He grabbed a chair from near her small dining table and pulled it over to face the couch where she sat. "What's your name?" he asked. "I mean your real name, not what they call you here." "My name in your language would be difficult to pronounce," she said with what might have been a smile. "But the closest sound would be Luna. It means bright light in darkness in my world's language." "Luna?" Jake repeated. "That's actually a name we use here too. It means moon." "How fitting," she said, touching the glowing skin on her arm. "Suppose I do look like moonlight to your eyes." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Jake found himself really looking at her for the first time. She wasn't just some alien being to be guarded. She was someone with thoughts and feelings, someone who had been taken from her world and trapped in this room for years. "What was your home like?" he asked. Luna's eyes seemed to brighten, and she began to describe a world that sounded like something from a dream. Cities that grew like crystals from the ground, reaching toward skies that were filled with dancing lights in every color imaginable. People who communicated as much through feeling as through words, who lived in harmony with their environment instead of fighting against it. "We traveled between the stars not to conquer or take resources," she explained, "but to learn and to share knowledge. My ship was on a mission to study your sun when something went wrong with our navigation systems. So you crashed here by accident." "Yes." "I was the only survivor." Her voice became sadder. "The others, they did not make it past the first day. Your world's atmosphere was too different for them, but I was able to adapt. I have been trying to find a way to contact my people ever since, but I do not know if any messages I send reach them." Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Luna, do you know what happened to your ship? The wreckage?" "Dr. Chen told me it was destroyed in the crash. Why do you ask?" Jake hesitated. He'd overheard conversations between Dr. Chen and other scientists about reverse engineering alien technology. He'd seen classified documents on her desk that mentioned multiple crash sites. But he wasn't supposed to know about any of that. "Nothing," he said. "I was just curious." Over the next few nights, Jake found himself spending more and more time in Luna's room during his shifts. She was incredibly intelligent, asking thoughtful questions about human culture and sharing stories about her own world. She had a way of listening that made Jake feel like he was the most important person in the universe, and gradually, he found himself opening up about things he'd never told anyone. He told her about his time in the military, about the friends he'd lost, and the guilt he carried. He told her about Kelly and how he'd pushed her away because he didn't know how to deal with his own emotions. He told her about feeling lost and directionless since leaving the service, like he didn't know who he was supposed to be in civilian life. Luna listened to everything without judgment, offering insights that seemed to come from a wisdom much older than her apparent age. She helped him understand that his pain was not a weakness, but a sign that he had loved deeply and lost people who mattered to him. "Your species is remarkable," she said one night as they sat together on her couch, sharing stories and watching the stars through her window. "You feel everything so intensely. Joy, sorrow, love, fear. On my world, we experience emotions differently, more gently. Sometimes I think that makes us wiser, but watching you, I think it might also make us less alive." Jake had never thought about emotions that way before. He'd always seen his feelings as something to control or overcome, not as something that made him more human. As the days passed, Jake realized he was breaking protocol in ways that went far beyond having conversations with Luna. He was bringing her books from the facility's library, showing her movies on his tablet, and even bringing her small gifts, like flowers he'd picked from the desert during his walks around the perimeter. Dr. Chen started noticing the changes. She commented on how much time Jake was spending in Luna's room, how Luna seemed more animated and responsive during the day. She reminded him that his job was to guard Luna, not to become her friend. "She's not human, Jake," Dr. Chen said during one of their weekly meetings. "Whatever connection you think you're forming with her, you need to remember that her species might experience relationships very differently than we do. Don't let your emotions compromise your judgment." But it was too late for warnings. Jake was already in too deep, found himself looking forward to his shifts, counting the hours until he could see Luna again. When she smiled at him or laughed at something he said, it felt like the sun coming out after a long winter. The problem was, he wasn't sure if what he was feeling was real or if Luna's alien nature was somehow influencing his emotions. She'd mentioned that her people could sense feelings, and he wondered if she was unconsciously making him care about her more than he should. The thought scared him, but not enough to stay away. Every night he found himself drawn back to her room, back to conversations that felt more real and honest than any he'd had in years. Luna was becoming more than just his assignment. She was becoming the most important person in his world. And that, Jake was beginning to realize, was either the best thing that had ever happened to him or the most dangerous. Jake noticed something was wrong with Luna on a Thursday night during his 7th week at the facility. When he arrived for his shift, she wasn't sitting by her window like usual. Instead, she was lying on her couch, curled up under a blanket, and the soft glow that always came from her skin had dimmed to almost nothing. "Luna," he said, opening her door without bothering to check the monitors first, "are you okay?" She turned to look at him, and Jake's heart sank. Her usually bright eyes looked dull and tired, and there were dark circles underneath them that he'd never seen before. She tried to sit up, but seemed to struggle with the effort. "I am not well," she said softly, her musical voice sounding weak and strained. Jake rushed to her side, kneeling beside the couch. "What's wrong? Should I call Dr. Chen?" "No," Luna said quickly, reaching out to grab his hand. Her touch was cool and trembling. "Please, not the doctors. They will want to run tests, and I cannot bear to be treated like a specimen right now." Jake looked at her with growing concern. In all the weeks he'd known her, Luna had never seemed fragile. She'd always carried herself with a quiet dignity. Even in captivity, seeing her like this made him realize how much he'd come to care about her well-being. "Then tell me what I can do to help," he said, sitting on the edge of the couch beside her. Luna was quiet for a long moment, and Jake thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she spoke so softly he had to lean closer to hear her. "My people, we are not meant to be alone," she whispered. "We need connection, not just conversation, but real understanding. I've been slowly fading since I arrived here, but talking with you these past weeks has kept me going. I think I am finally running out of strength." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean you're dying? Not dying exactly, but withering, like a plant that gets water but no sunlight." She looked up at him with those deep, dark eyes. "On my world, we share not just words but feelings, memories, the essence of who we are. Without that connection, we become shadows of ourselves." Jake didn't know what to say. The idea that Luna was slowly fading away because of loneliness was heartbreaking, but he didn't understand how he could help. He wasn't from her world, Couldn't give her the kind of connection she was talking about. "What about when we talk?" he asked. "Doesn't that help?" "Yes, but it is not enough anymore." "Need." She paused, seeming to struggle with finding the right words. "I need someone to truly see me, not as an alien or a prisoner or even a friend, but as myself, completely and without fear." That night, Jake barely left Luna's side, sat with her as she drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing shallow and her skin growing paler by the hour. He found himself holding her hand, not caring about the cameras or what Dr. Chen might think. All that mattered was making sure Luna wasn't alone. During the quiet hours before dawn, Luna opened her eyes and looked at him with more focus than she'd shown all evening. "Jake," she said, "I need to tell you something important. What I'm asking of you, the connection my people need, it is not just emotional. It involves sharing everything we are with another person. Your species might call it love, but it is deeper than that. It is becoming part of someone else's soul." Jake felt his heart racing. "Luna, I know it is frightening," she continued. "And I know you worry that your feelings for me might not be real, that my nature might be influencing you somehow. But I need you to know that what you feel comes from your own heart. I cannot create emotions that are not already there. I can only recognize them." The truth hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been falling in love with Luna, had been fighting those feelings for weeks, telling himself it was impossible or wrong or dangerous. But sitting there in the dim light of her room, watching her struggle just to stay conscious, he realized that his feelings were the most real thing in his life. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Luna's eyes filled with something that looked like hope mixed with fear. "I need you to let me show you who I really am. All of it, my memories, my fears, my dreams, everything I have been keeping hidden. And I need you to share yourself with me the same way. It is the only way my people can truly connect with another being." Jake understood what she was asking, and it terrified him. To open himself completely to another person, to let down every wall he'd built to protect himself from pain, was the most frightening thing he could imagine. But looking at Luna, seeing how much she needed this connection to survive, he knew he couldn't let fear stop him. "How do we do it?" he asked. Luna sat up slowly, taking both of his hands in hers. "Close your eyes and trust me," she said. "Think about everything you are, everything you have been, everything you hope to become. Hold nothing back." Jake closed his eyes and felt Luna's cool hands on his face. At first, nothing happened. Then, gradually, he began to feel something he'd never experienced before. It was like Luna was gently touching his thoughts, his memories, the deepest parts of himself that he'd never shared with anyone. He saw his childhood through her eyes, felt her understanding of his fears and insecurities. He experienced her memories of her homeworld, the loss of her family in the crash, the loneliness of her years in captivity. But more than that, he felt her love for him, pure and simple and completely honest. For the first time in his life, Jake felt truly known by another person. Every mistake he'd made, every moment of weakness, every time he'd failed someone he cared about, Luna saw it all and loved him anyway. And in return, he saw her completely, understood her strength and wisdom and the incredible courage it had taken for her. To survive 3 years of imprisonment without losing hope, when the connection finally ended, they were both crying. But Luna's skin had regained its soft glow, and her eyes were bright and clear again. Jake felt different too, like he'd been carrying a heavy weight his whole life and had finally been allowed to set it down. "Now you know," Luna said softly, "that what we feel for each other is real." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the sun began to rise outside her window. For the first time since he'd taken this job, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But their moment of peace didn't last long. The next morning, Dr. Chen called Jake into her office. She had security footage from the night before. Footage that showed Jake spending the entire night in Luna's room, holding her, comforting her in ways that went far beyond his job description. "This has to stop," Dr. Chen said, her voice cold and professional. "You've compromised the mission, Jake. Your emotional attachment to the subject is affecting your judgment. Her name is Luna, Jake said quietly. And she was dying. She's not human, Jake. What you think you're feeling for her, it's not real. Her species has abilities we don't fully understand. She could be manipulating your emotions without you even realizing it. But Jake knew better now, after sharing that deep connection with Luna. He understood exactly what his feelings were and where they came from. Dr. Chen's warnings couldn't touch the certainty he felt in his heart. You're wrong, he said. What I feel for her is the most real thing in my life. Dr. Chen looked at him with something that might have been pity. Then you're no longer suitable for this assignment. I'm recommending your termination, effective immediately. As Jake left her office, he realized that losing his job was the least of his worries. He was in love with someone who was being held prisoner, and there was no way their relationship could continue as long as she remained in captivity. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Jake began to think about what it would take to set Luna free. Jake had 3 days left before his termination became official, and he was spending every moment he could with Luna. Dr. Chen had restricted his access to most of the facility, but she hadn't completely banned him from Luna's room yet. Maybe. She thought a few more days wouldn't matter, or maybe she was hoping Jake would come to his senses and accept that his assignment was over. She was wrong on both counts. On his second to last night, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. He was walking through the facility during his final rounds when he noticed Dr. Chen's office door was slightly open. The light was on, and he could hear her talking on the phone. Something in her tone made him stop and listen. Yes, sir, the test subject in Section 7 has become too attached to the guard, Dr. Chen was saying. We'll need to move her to the Colorado facility by the end of the week. Jake's blood ran cold. Colorado facility. Luna had never mentioned anything about being moved, and Dr. Chen certainly hadn't told him about it. No, sir, she won't be a problem during transport. We have methods to keep subjects calm during relocation. There was a pause. Yes, the other specimens are ready for the next phase of testing as well. Other specimens? Jake pressed himself against the wall, trying to hear more. The one from the Arizona crash is responding well to the new procedures. And the 2 from Nevada are showing promising results. We should have enough data for the military application within 6 months. Jake felt sick. Luna wasn't the only one. There were others like her being held in different facilities, being experimented on. And Luna was about to be moved somewhere. Else, somewhere Jake would never be able to find her. He quietly backed away from the office and made his way to Luna's room. She was sitting by her window as usual, but when she saw his face, she immediately knew something was wrong. Jake, what has happened? He told her everything he'd overheard. Luna listened in silence, but Jake could see the fear growing in her eyes. I knew this day would come, she said softly. Dr. Chen has been asking more questions lately, wanting to know about our technology, our abilities. I've been refusing to cooperate, but I feared they would eventually lose patience. Luna, there are others, other people from your world. Being held in different places, Luna's composure finally cracked. Tears began to fall down her glowing cheeks, and she put her hands over her face. I prayed that I was the only one, that the others had found a way to escape or return home. But deep in my heart, I knew the truth. Jake knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. We have to get you out of here. Tonight. No. It is too dangerous. If they catch you helping me escape, they will put you in prison for the rest of your life. I cannot ask you to sacrifice everything for me. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Jake looked into her eyes, remembering the deep connection they'd shared, the way she'd seen every part of his soul, and loved him anyway. Luna, before I met you, I was just drifting through life, not really living. You've shown me what it means to truly care about someone, to have something worth fighting for. I can't let them take you away. Luna was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Finally, she nodded. If we do this, there will be no going back. You will become a fugitive, wanted by your own government. Are you prepared for that life? As long as it's with you? Yes. They spent the next hour planning their escape. Luna had been studying the facility's layout for 3 years, noting guard rotations and security procedures. She knew about the emergency exits, the blind spots in the camera coverage, and the best route to the motor pool where the facility's vehicles were kept. "There is something else you should know," Luna said, as they finalized their plan. "Once we leave this place, I will be able to use abilities that I have been hiding. Dr. Chen suspects I have them, but she has never seen them. I did not want to give her more reasons to study me." "What kind of abilities?" "I can sense the emotions and intentions of others at a distance. I can make myself difficult to notice when I choose to be, and in extreme situations I can influence the behavior of others, though I try never to use that power." Jake felt a moment of uncertainty. "You've never used that power on me, have you?" Luna reached out and touched his face gently. "Never. What you feel for me, what I feel for you, it is pure and honest. I would not sully something so precious with manipulation." At 2 in the morning, they put their plan into action. Jake used his security codes to disable the cameras in Luna's hallway, making it look like a routine maintenance issue. Luna used her ability to sense the guards' locations, guiding them through the facility by routes that avoided detection. They made it to the motor pool without being seen. But as Jake was hot-wiring one of the facility's SUVs, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Someone had discovered Luna's empty room. "Go, go," Luna said, jumping into the passenger seat as Jake got the engine started. They raced through the desert night, headlights cutting through the darkness as Jake pushed the SUV as fast as it would. "Go." Behind them, he could see other vehicles giving chase, their lights growing brighter in the rearview mirror. "There's a town about 50 miles from here," Jake said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them in the streets." "Jake, stop the car," Luna said suddenly. "What?" "Luna, they're right behind us. Trust me. Stop the car." Jake hit the brakes, and the SUV skidded to a halt in the middle of the empty desert highway. The pursuing vehicles were less than a mile behind them now, their lights visible over the next hill. Luna got out of the car and stood in the middle of the road, her arms raised toward the approaching vehicles. Jake watched in amazement as her skin began to glow brighter than he'd ever seen it, like she was made of starlight. The first pursuit vehicle crested the hill and immediately began to slow down. Then the second one. Within moments, all 3 cars had stopped completely. Their engines still running, but their drivers apparently unable to continue the chase. "What did you do?" Jake asked as Luna got back in the car. "I convinced them that they lost us at the last intersection and should search in a different direction," she said simply. "It will not fool them for long, but it should give us enough time to reach the town." They drove in silence for a while, both processing what had just happened. Jake had always known Luna was special, but seeing her use her abilities so powerfully was both amazing and a little frightening. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Luna said softly. "I know it changes how you think of me." Jake reached over and took her hand. "Doesn't change anything. You're still the same person who shared her soul with me, who helped me understand what love really means. These abilities, they're just part of who you are." As they reached the outskirts of the small desert town, Jake realized that Luna was right about one thing. There was no going back now. He was officially a fugitive, wanted for helping an alien prisoner escape from a government facility. His old life was over. But looking at Luna beside him, her hand in his as they drove toward an uncertain future, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something that really mattered. He was fighting for love, for freedom, and for the chance to build a life with someone who truly understood him. The road ahead was dark and full of unknown dangers, but they were facing it together, and that, Jake thought, made all the difference in the world. 6 months had passed since Jake and Luna escaped from the facility, and they had built a life together that felt like something from a dream. Their home was a small cabin tucked away in the mountains of Oregon, surrounded by tall pine trees, and far from any main roads. Jake had used his military contacts to get them new identities, and Luna had used her abilities to make sure they stayed invisible to anyone who might be looking for them. The cabin was simple, but comfortable. Jake had fixed up the old wood stove and repaired the roof, while Luna had turned the small garden into something magical. Her touch seemed to make plants grow faster and stronger, and their vegetable garden produced more food than 2 people could possibly eat. She said it reminded her of home, tending to growing things and watching them flourish. Every morning, Jake would wake up next to Luna and still couldn't quite believe this was his life now. She would be sleeping peacefully, her skin giving off that soft glow that had fascinated him from the first moment he saw her. When she opened those deep, dark eyes and smiled at him, Jake felt like the luckiest person in the world. But lately, something had been different about Luna. She seemed tired more often. Sometimes Jake would catch her staring off into the distance with a thoughtful expression that made him worry. When he asked her about it, she would just smile and say she was fine, but Jake knew her well enough now to sense when something was on her mind. The truth came out on a quiet evening in late autumn. They were sitting by the fireplace, Luna reading one of the many books Jake had bought for her, when she suddenly closed the book and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Jake," she said softly, "I need to tell you something important." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. In his experience, conversations that started that way rarely ended well. "What is it? Are you sick again?" "No, I am not sick." Luna took his hands in hers, and Jake could feel that she was nervous. "Jake, I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Jake couldn't process what she'd said. Then the words hit him like a physical blow, and he stared at her in shock. "A baby? But ... how is that possible?" "I mean, we're different species," Dr. Chen said. Dr. Chen said many things that were wrong, Luna replied gently. She did not understand my people as well as she thought she did. When two beings share the kind of deep connection that we have, when they truly become part of each other's souls, new life can be created regardless of what species they come from. Jake felt tears starting to form in his eyes. A baby. He was going to be a father. The idea was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. "Are you okay? I mean, is this safe for you?" Luna smiled, and her whole face seemed to light up. "I am more than okay. I am happy, Jake. This child is proof that love really can overcome any barrier. Our baby will be something new, a bridge between your world and mine." Over the next few months, Jake watched in amazement as Luna's pregnancy progressed. Her already glowing skin became even more radiant, and she seemed to have an energy and joy that was infectious. Jake found himself talking to her belly every night, telling their unborn child stories about both Earth and Luna's homeworld. But their peaceful life was interrupted when Luna began sensing other minds nearby. At first, Jake thought it might be government agents who had finally tracked them down. But Luna explained that these thoughts felt different, familiar in a way that made her heart race with hope. "There are others," she told Jake one morning, her eyes bright with excitement. "Others like me who have escaped from the facilities. They are looking for safe places to hide, and they can sense that we are here." Over the next few weeks, they began to make contact with other survivors. There was Kai, who had escaped from a facility in Arizona and had been living in the desert for 2 years. There was Zara, who had been freed when her guard, a woman named Amy, had fallen in love with her, just like Jake had with Luna. There was even an older being named Elder Vin, who had been the first to crash on Earth nearly 10 years ago and had been waiting patiently for others to find him. Each survivor had a story similar to Luna's. They had come to Earth as explorers or refugees, had been captured and imprisoned, and had eventually found their way to freedom through the help of humans who saw them as people rather than prisoners. Some of those humans had chosen to stay, with them forming relationships that transcended species and created something beautiful and new. As Luna's pregnancy progressed, their small community grew into something resembling a family. The other survivors helped prepare for the baby, sharing knowledge about childbirth and child-rearing from their world. The humans who had helped them shared their own experiences and offered support in practical ways. Jake had never imagined he would be part of something like this. A community of humans and aliens living together in harmony, creating families, and building a future that neither species could have achieved alone. It felt like a glimpse of what the world could be like if fear and suspicion were replaced with understanding and love. The night Luna went into labor, Jake was more terrified than he'd ever been in his life. But Elder Ven and the other survivors were there to help, using their knowledge and abilities to make sure both Luna and the baby were safe. Amy, who had become like a sister to Jake over the past months, held his hand and reminded him to breathe. When their daughter was finally born, Jake felt his world change completely. She was perfect, tiny and beautiful, with skin that shifted between Luna's soft glow and normal human pink depending on her mood. Her eyes were large and dark like her mother's, but they had flecks of brown that reminded Jake of his own eyes. "She's incredible," Jake whispered, holding his daughter for the first time. "She's perfect." "She is hope," Luna said softly, watching Jake cradle their baby. "Hope for both our peoples, proof that different worlds can come together and create something wonderful." As Jake looked down at his daughter, he realized that everything he'd been through had led to this moment. The desperation that had driven him to take the job at the facility, the loneliness that had made him open his heart to Luna, the courage that had helped him choose love over safety when they escaped. It had all been leading to this new life they'd created together. Their daughter would grow up in a world where the boundaries between species didn't matter, where love was more important than fear, and where being different was something to celebrate rather than hide. She would be living proof that the future could be brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. Outside their cabin, snow was beginning to fall, covering the mountains in a blanket of white. But inside, surrounded by their chosen family of humans and aliens who had found each other against all odds, Jake felt nothing but warmth. He had started this journey as a desperate man, taking a job he didn't understand. Now he was a father, a partner, and a protector of something precious and new. He had found his purpose, his family, and his home in the most unexpected place possible. Looking at Luna and their sleeping daughter, Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had created something beautiful. In a world that had tried to keep them apart, and that was worth fighting for, the future was uncertain, but it was theirs to build, one day at a time.